So I know I've been really behind on getting my 1800X benchmarks out.
Like really behind.
But I finally have them all finished and they're ready to go. And today I want to go over those and sort of do a different format than I normally would. Instead of just throwing up graphs, I'm going to sort of take you through the spreadsheet. I'll put the spreadsheet link in the description below you so you can take a look at it yourself. But we're going to walk through it together and sort of draw any conclusions that we can from it. So let's go to it. Okay, so on screen we have my benchmarks that I took, mostly from the 4790K, the 1800X, and the 8350. All these benchmarks were run at both stock speeds and overclock speeds. I will say that my overclock on the 8350 here was a little bit sloppy because I could not remember how far I had pushed it before. So I just went with a 4.6 gigahertz overclock. It was perfectly stable, no issues there. However, I do believe that the 8350 that I have can definitely push beyond that. I believe I ran it at 4.8 before, but we just went with 4.6 because it's really in there more as a laughable comparison than anything else. Let's start with the top here, the benchmarking tools, and these are more synthetic and workstation type benchmarks. They're less gaming oriented. And we'll sort of start with the single thread of the Cinebench. And in this case, the 4790K running at 4.7 gigahertz pulled a 191, and the best I could ever get, or the best I saw with my 1800X overclock to 4 gigahertz, which was the highest I could get that, was a 163, which it's a respectable score. It's just, the fact is that Ryzen single thread performance just is not on par with Intel just yet. And if you are heavily involved in single-threaded workflow, such as gaming, and we'll see that when we get down to the gaming benchmarks if you peek ahead down there. But if your work or your gaming involves single-threaded workloads for the most part, then the Ryzen chip just isn't going to perform quite as well as the Intel parts. When you flip over to the multi-threaded performance, things shift drastically. If you look at the 4790K overclocked to 4.7 gigahertz, it pulled just under 1,000 at 942. And the 1800X is way ahead of it at 1768. And of course, it's a synthetic benchmark that perfectly multi-threads for the most part. So yes, the 1800X is going to blow out the 4790K. And we saw that reflected there, as well as the CPU-Z benchmarks, where the 4790K was less than half of the 1800X. What was interesting with the CPU-Z benchmark, though, was the single-thread performance actually still favored the 1800X as well. So it is possible that in certain applications, your Ryzen chips will perform, even in single-threaded tasks, pretty much as well as Intel's. It just really depends on the application. Now, in the Adobe Premiere Pro renders, I did a short render and a long render. Now, the short render was one of my shorter videos, and the long render was just one of my longest videos, and I just rendered those out. The highlighted speed here on the 1800X overclocked to 4.0 gigahertz. This was when my RAM was running at 2133 megahertz. And the reason I didn't redo this benchmark was just because I had already uninstalled CS6, which is what the benchmarks were run on, and I was then running on Creative Cloud. And I will say that the Creative Cloud suite seems to do a little bit better. And I'm not sure whether that's because it's just better optimized for CPUs now, or if it had to do more with GPU optimization, or whether it was a little bit of both. But the Creative Cloud suite did render these videos a little bit faster. But since I don't have the 4790K anymore, I could not rerun all these on both. So I sort of stuck with the CS6 benchmark, and everything else in the 1800X 4.0 gigahertz column is actually over, or the RAM is clocked up to 2933, with the exception of those yellow highlighted boxes. On the stock side of the 1800X, I went with the complete defaults that the memory ran out from the out of the box motherboard, just hit optimized defaults, and that ended up being 2133 megahertz. So the RAM is different also, and that's because in my mind, the average user, if they're not an overclocker, if you're not an overclocker, you're probably not going to dive into the UEFI settings to get your RAM up to speed either. So I went with completely defaults and then the overclock. And in my testing, the RAM speed didn't make a huge difference anyways, but it is worth pointing out that these two boxes were run at lower speeds. You'll see that the 1800X does beat the 4790K in Premiere Pro CS6. However, the gains are not a whole lot. So if you're just doing some basic video editing, then and also gaming, I don't feel that an upgrade is really warranted. Just sort of my thoughts on that. If your use case scenario is heavily workstation influenced, then maybe there's an upgrade that's warranted. But in my benchmark here, it's sort of not really worth. And if you pop down to the Audacity audio renders, you'll see that the 4790K destroys the 1800X. And the reason for that is if you pull up the task manager when you're running Audacity and specifically exporting audio, you'll notice that Audacity is mostly a single-threaded application. It does use some extra threads a little bit, but for the most part, it's single-threaded, which obviously favors the Intel platform. If you hop over to Firestrike, that benchmark, you'll notice that the 1800X wins in everything, marginally in most cases, with the exception of the physics score. And that's, again, because Firestrike scales well with physics and uses all 16 of those threads. So the 1800X does destroy the 4790K in the physics score by about 7,000, a little bit more than 7,000. So big win there for the 1800X. If you're looking overall at these sort of productivity benchmarks and synthetic benchmarks, you'll basically notice that the 1800X, although it really wins big with benchmarks that use the multi-threading well, in real-world applications like the Adobe render, it's not really beating out the 4790K by much. So if you're already on an i7 quad-core 8-thread part, then I'm not sure that you should be upgrading if this is sort of your use case scenario. If you happen to use applications that scale really well with extra threads, and I may not be testing those, but if you have your own applications or the applications you use do scale well with more threads, then the upgrade may be worth your while. But if you're just using Adobe for your video editing, you're not really doing much other than that as far as the video editing side of things go, and you're also just doing some gaming, then probably not worth an upgrade, at least right now. If you're a live streamer, that could be completely different, though. If you're a live streamer that uses the H.264 encoder, then I did notice, and this is more anecdotal than anything, but I did notice that when I was streaming my Rocket League, as well as obviously playing the same game and streaming all off the same system, I did definitely notice a humongous improvement from the 4790K to the 1800X. So if you're a live streamer, then you may want to look at the Ryzen chips, because those extra threads do come in handy, because the game will use its threads and the streaming will use its threads, and they won't overlap so much, and you'll have plenty of resources to stream live with high-quality streaming as well as high-quality gaming without giving up a lot of performance. Now, if we pop down to the gaming benchmarks, and I'm going to focus on, again, the overclocks, because I don't run my chips at stock. They're just sort of there in case you do. But in the overclock side of things, the Heaven benchmark, the average, you give up a few frames per second by being on the Ryzen side of things. And I do have these simulated 1600X benchmarks over here, which aren't really, I wouldn't really pay any attention to those. Those are more done as an experimental, like, hey, what might we expect? When we actually get 1600X benchmarks out, I will be very curious to see how well or how close I actually was, but sort of take those with a humongous grain of salt. But with the Heaven benchmark, you're really not giving much up with the 1800X versus a 4790K. GTA 5 is a different story. You'll notice the average that I ran on the 4790 was almost 53 frames per second, dropped clear down to 37 frames per second on the 1800X. So you lose a lot in GTA 5. And that was by far the biggest gap that I saw in my testing. You'll notice the rest of the testing at 1440p is pretty much, it's within margins. You could run, like the Shadow of Mordor test, you could run it 30 times and it might split fairly equally. In my testing, though, the 4790K did top the 1800X barely in that test. The sort of strange standout for me was Fallout. And I don't really know why the 1800X ran it as well as it did in my test. Part of that may be that there may have been a circumstance in the game that sort of accounted for the difference in the frame rate there, because no two runs of that benchmark, because it is a user-based benchmark, so no two runs are perfectly identical. So it's possible something happened in the 4790K benchmark that sort of threw it off a little bit, or the 1800X may have had a slightly lighter load there. So again, I wouldn't read too much into the Fallout 4 benchmark. It was close to the same, but there may have been something there that happened that sort of skewed it a little bit in favor of the 1800X. Because if you go over to the stock side of things, the 4790K does win, barely though. And you'll notice the maximum frame rate was heavily in favor of the 1800X in that one, and the minimum was tied. So Fallout 4, take it with a grain of salt, but the 1800X did perform very well with Fallout 4. And for that matter, it performed extremely well with Project Cars as well. And what I like about Project Cars is, even though, again, that's a user benchmark, my benchmark that I ran it with was 1 lap on the, it was one of the Dubai courses. So even though it is user-based, it's still fairly standardized. And what I like about Project Cars is how tight the frame rates are. You go from a minimum of, on the 1800X, 29 to a maximum of 40. That's 11 frames. And that's a really tight spread for a frame rate. And again, you'll notice the 4790K does edge out the 1800X, but again, so marginal. We're talking less than half a frame per second on average. So in Project Cars, virtually no difference. And you may be asking or wondering why I didn't run these at 1080p. And the simple answer is I game at 1440. And although I know a lot of people do game at 1080p, I feel like if you're buying a $300+ processor, it's going to be plenty for 1080p gaming. I'll just put it that way. Unless your graphics card is just incredibly underpowered for what you're doing. Maybe you just do a bunch of video editing and you just game on the side, so you don't need a really powerful GPU. So, but even with like a very, very mid-tier GPU, you're going to be gaming at 1080p just fine. So I sort of ran it in the case that I felt like most people with this chip would probably be using it, and that'd be 1440p. And I do understand that at 1440p, the CPU implication or impact is a little bit less than it might otherwise be, because you're putting more of the bottleneck is probably more based on the GPU at that point. But in my mind, again, the 1800X is not a CPU that's geared just towards gaming. It's a CPU that's geared towards productivity and gaming on the side as well. And in my use case, I game at 1440p. So that's sort of the explanation of why I ran these benchmarks the way I did. I'm going to leave a link again for this spreadsheet in the description down below, so you can pull it up and look at it yourself. This is more of an informative piece for you guys. This is just one more benchmark, or one more set of benchmarks, rather, to add to the pile of benchmarks that's already piled up. And you can sort of take it for what it's worth, take it at face value, take it however you want. But that's really all there is to say about these benchmarks. Still a really, really solid processor. And I've been super happy with the Ryzen chip so far. So what do you guys think? Is the 1800X the chip for you, or is there some other chip like the 1700 that may serve you better, or would a 7700K serve you as a gamer better? Give me your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this content, you can give me a like down below as well, share, subscribe, those things are super helpful. You can follow me on Instagram and on Twitter at Hoosier Hardware, because I throw up lots of pretty pictures sometimes when I'm doing things like building the computer behind me. And of course, I'll let YouTube throw up a couple videos here for your viewing pleasure. I am Shane from Hoosier Hardware, and I'll see you guys in the next video.